Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoy this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. Welcome to episode 10 of the fourth season of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby. Our goal here at Momentum for Change is to shine a light on innovative, promising programs available to support survivors and prevent further harm from occurring. One of these approaches that we are all so excited about at MOCADSV is coming out of the UMKC Institute for Human Development with a program for screening individuals who may have experienced a traumatic brain injury. Several coalition members have already started to incorporate this screening tool into services and are finding it to be helpful in providing comprehensive advocacy services that meet survivors where they are truly at and address the trauma they've experienced. Here to talk about this program is Beth Dauber, the project coordinator for health and aging at the UMKC Institute for Human Development. We are also joined for this conversation by Cara Jones, member services specialist at MOCADSV, and Ashlea Whaley, partnership development specialist at MOCADSV. Beth, Cara, and Ashlea, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Let's start off with a round of introductions. Ashlea, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so like Nora said, I work in partnership development with the coalition. My primary focuses currently are really health-related efforts and violence prevention efforts, and that's how I got connected and started with the brain injury work.
Thank you for having me back, Nora. I'm always happy to be on the podcast. And my name is Cara Jones, and I am a member services specialist at the coalition. And I think my background in TBI comes more in the form of strangulation, specifically in the direct service program that I was in prior to my joining the coalition.
Great.
I'm super excited to be here. I'm Beth Dauber. I'm a project coordinator with University of Missouri Kansas City's Institute for Human Development. I have been with IHD for next week will be my 2-year anniversary. It's hard to believe. But prior to that, I worked with Missouri Vocational Rehabilitation for 14 years in a variety of roles. In my current role, I focus a lot on our brain injury grant and some systems change work, but I also help out and support some of our other projects like our CDC Health Equity and some other things as well.
That's wonderful. Congrats on 2 years, Beth. That is awesome. And I always like to start off just by hearing how people got involved in the work that they're doing now. So Beth, can you tell us how you got involved in TBI advocacy?
Sure. So I wish there was some clear path as to this was the determining factor moment. But really, I think I've really been fascinated by the brain for as long as I can remember. I mean, the brain is just how it works and how it rewires itself and everything is just really fascinating. I will say when I was in undergrad, I took this learning and motivation course, and that was really a deep dive into kind of some of how the brain works and some different things. And that was maybe a little bit of a turning point. But I think where I really drank the brain injury Kool-Aid, as we say, was during my internship at Missouri Rehab. So I was at the Head Injury Resource Center there and had some really amazing mentors, and they really let me get creative in what I was doing and in my internship and really kind of be very hands-on and see the rehab process and seeing people improve after they've had these injuries and kind of seeing some of those components was just really amazing and seeing their progress over time. And acquired disabilities are just really unique in that they can happen to anybody at any time. They're non-discriminatory. And so that was something that I just really found fascinating. So After completing my internships, I started with folk rehab as a brain injury specialist and supporting people with returning to work after having brain injuries. And that, again, just kind of solidified it. And so I did that for a number of years and then worked in management for a while. And then my last couple of years there, I was the assistant director of rehabilitation technology and helped train counselors across the state with brain injury informed practices.
Wow, so many things, little nuggets that you mentioned there that are so interesting. But I agree. I think this is a fascinating time to be doing work around the intersection of trauma and neurobiology because we know so much more than we've ever known before. And I think clearly we can use it to inform how we support survivors. And so that's just really exciting to me too. And I also just like want to know more. I'm hungry for it. So Ashlea and Cara, Ashlea, you mentioned that your interest really comes in health promotion efforts. Cara, you said strangulation. Anything else you all would like to share about how you got interested in TBI specifically?
I always tell everyone that Beth and I's connection was serendipitous. It happened because the coalition's wonderful Aaron Skoski was in a data viz class with Beth. And as Aaron was talking about, the coalition and what we do, what we offer, Beth had this light bulb moment of, oh my gosh, we need to get connected. And so we did the connection thing and we started to go through it. And at first I was very like, okay, yeah, I see it. Let me figure out maybe where this fits into our current work and what we're doing. And then a few days pass and it's all I see, right? You start to think about our survivors and our advocates and the stories that we get at the coalition on a daily basis, plus, my own lived experience as an advocate. And it just intertwines in a way that, violence and abuse almost doesn't exist without the impact of brain injury in much of a way that we assume, trauma and mental health go together. It is almost an inherent side effect. Once that really clicked and I really started to think on the applications and my experiences, I came back to Beth and I said, yeah, we got to do it. Let's figure out how to do this. And it took us a little bit to really nail down what exactly does this look like? How does this function and what are our roles, right? And it really, I think the big kicker took, Beth moving on to her role at UMKC and having a little more flexibility and leeway, right, to really put the framework down for this work and get going. So I didn't start interested, but in the way that it ended, I couldn't not be.
That makes so much sense. Anything you wanted to add in, Cara?
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Ashlea said. I come from a background of both community-based and systems-based advocacy. And so just hearing stories of survivors and I had the privilege of I think all advocates want to be forever learners, and so I had the privilege of taking the advanced course on strangulation prevention. And once I went through that whole course and recognized like how scary, how significant, and how severe strangulation is, but also how common I was hearing it in the survivor stories that I worked with, it was just really that there's just clearly this lack of awareness to how significant and severe they are. And so I think that's where that passion began of like, we have to be doing more.
So as we're starting our conversation about some of these dynamics and picking it apart, really developing an understanding of the intersection of brain injury and domestic and sexual violence, I would love to just start off with an understanding of the terms. Would one of you all give our listeners an explanation of what the difference is between brain injury and traumatic brain injury?
I can take that one. So, acquired brain injury is really the umbrella term, and then it's broken up into two categories, traumatic and non traumatic. So, traumatic brain injuries are any kind of external force. So, you think of falls and assaults, motor vehicle accidents, sports injuries, so forth. So, something external is causing the brain injury. Whereas non traumatic is an internal force. So those are things like strokes and brain tumors, and then also anoxic injuries due to strangulation. It's not that a non-traumatic brain injury isn't traumatic, but in the sense of terminology, that's kind of how it's broken up.
interesting. And I can see how probably the vast majority of brain injuries related to violence would be considered TBIs. But I could also see how the stress and the impact that violence can have on health could also contribute to BIs. So as Ashlea was saying, these issues are all very related. So let's get into some of those connections. Cara, you were saying earlier that strangulation is really common for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, but how common is TBIs for survivors of domestic and sexual violence? How prevalent are we all seeing that being something that happens within an abusive relationship?
I think, unfortunately, we don't have, of course, an exact number because we know that domestic violence just in general is significantly underreported. I was listening to an NPR article just this morning that was saying, from 2024, that was saying, 1 in 3 is the statistic that we go with for domestic violence. And of those, we can assume that most of those have had at least some kind of strangulation or traumatic brain injury. So most survivors who have experienced domestic violence have also experienced strangulation or a traumatic brain injury. So it's going to be a large amount.
So would it be fair to say if you are working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, you are working with survivors of traumatic brain injury?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, I think our listeners
really
would
like
be interested in that. So the kind of unique thing, one of the unique dynamics of domestic violence is that we're often dealing with traumatic events, violent events that happen over time. And so, can you speak to the impact of brain injury that is maybe compounded by multiple traumatic events?
Yes. So there was, I mean, again, you're right. If you are in this relationship, there is a risk for multiple injuries over time for sure. And I was just reading our journal article from 2024. And I don't think it was the same one, but it was talking about specifically about repeated injuries and that the lifetime injuries and those episodes are linked to worse symptoms across thinking, mood, and physical health. So, more lifetime injuries were significantly associated with greater severity of cognition, physical, emotional, and overall symptoms. And in the article, it was kind of indicating that 4 or more was kind of the pivotal point to really having increase in symptom burden. So, definitely, there is a huge risk there.
And I think if you think about all the research, most of the research, unfortunately, for TBIs has been done in, like accidents or in football, in sports specifically. We know that, like, say a football player has a concussion or brain injury, a traumatic brain injury, kind of the resolution to that is, of course, rest. You're going to be taken off the field and you're not playing until that brain injury, the traumatic brain injury, heals. We're not given, like, survivors don't have that luxury to rest their brain. Chances are they're going to receive another head injury or brain injury before they're recovered. So they don't have that option. And so if you are receiving another traumatic brain injury before your brain heals, that's further compounding the symptoms that you're already experiencing.
That's such an important point. I'm so glad you spoke to that. So, speaking of symptoms, what are some symptoms that advocates or survivors could be looking for that could indicate a brain injury?
So, I mean, if you think about the brain, it's really responsible for all facets of your body. So, brain injuries could then impact any module or anything that anything could be impacted by that. Typically, when you think about brain injury symptoms, it kind of falls into 3 categories: cognitive, physical, and behavioral emotional. So, if you think cognitive is things like organization and planning, time management, attention, memory, task initiation, follow through. But thinking about that in the individuals that you're working with, that may show up as that they are missing appointments, they're not following through on the directions that you give them, they're forgetting things, they're not paying attention, they're not completing tasks, things like that. And then physical could be things like headaches, chronic pain, weakness. sleep difficulties, slurred speech, disrupted gait, or balance difficulties. And so, how that could show up, people may think that someone is under the influence of substances because their speech pattern is slurred or that they are stumbling or things like that. But that could then be related to brain injury. And then also thinking about chronic pain and headaches and how that can impact your ability to show up and participate in services and get those supports. And then also behavioral emotional. So, struggling with emotional regulation. Those are individuals that may become tearful easily or angry easily. And kind of, we talk about like having a short fuse and just getting very frustrated and struggling to manage that. They may also struggle with things like a social interaction. So we talk a lot about the social filter, like the things that you have in your head that you keep there that they don't come out. And sometimes people with brain injury struggle with that. So it comes out and then that can definitely impact their social relationships. And then also things like irritability, which also can go into frustration tolerance and other things. So again, thinking about the individuals that you're working with that may be labeled as difficult or non-compliant or unmotivated, some of those things really could be underlying brain injury.
Thank you for breaking that down. That's super helpful, Beth. So if you're working with a survivor who's maybe experienced like a brain injury due to physical violence, or some of those symptoms sound familiar, what kind of recommendations would you have for that survivor? Like what kind of treatment options or screening options would you all recommend?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
So
go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah. So I think the first step is finding a to get screened. And we'll get a little bit into our NASHA OBISSS programming later. Having that knowledge first and foremost is going to be so beneficial when you go to talk to a primary care provider or a caseworker or whoever, right? Knowing that you have this framework in order to potentially get a diagnosis down the line and get those medical interventions are just priceless. The other thing with that is then you get removed as a survivor, you get removed from that label that I think some people inherently give you of being difficult or not having a reason for all of these things, right? And it helps establish a different lens for your own recovery because we have to understand that brain injured individuals are not going to recover linearly, as most people with trauma don't. But it's that extra layer of you've gone up through this trauma, you now have a physical injury that isn't visible, right? And that is going to impact the speed at which you recover and the paths that you take to either remove yourself from an abusive relationship or get yourself into a shelter, out of a shelter, getting your own housing, etc. Right? The path now looks significantly different than somebody who is not brain injured. So understanding that having this information definitely empowers you in your recovery process.
That's so helpful to know. And I think some of those dynamics are also really helpful for service providers to know. I was thinking especially about service providers who work in residential settings, so in emergency shelters, about how important it is just to have like a basic understanding of the kind of screening possibilities, the treatment possibilities for survivors who've experienced TBIs. I was really interested, Beth, when you were saying that symptoms often could look like somebody who's under the influence of a substance, which happens a lot in residential settings, right? Also to be on the lookout that that could be a sign of a TBI. Do you all have any other thoughts for service providers specifically around responding to survivors who've experienced TBIs?
Yeah, so I want to touch on that piece you just mentioned about looking like somebody may be under the influence of substances. There is also the very real possibility that they are utilizing substances in order to cope with the symptoms that TBI brings about, right? And so I think one of the things that is just so significant for providers to understand is that when you take the brain injury lens and you automatically apply it to all casework that you're doing or all services that you're doing yourself and your clients a kindness. Even if they don't screen positive for a brain injury, or if they screen positive and choose not to act on those services at this time, those brain injury lenses that you're providing in casework still make casework more manageable, more reasonable, and provide survivors with the tools necessary to succeed in case there are other co-occurring instances happening that may not necessarily be brain injury related. One of the questions that I think Beth and I get a lot when we're introducing this program to individual agencies is, I've screened them, I've given them the resources, they're not using it, now what? And I very candidly say I don't care that they're not using it right now, because recovery isn't linear, and because often we understand that when survivors come into shelter or simply are utilizing outreach services even, there are other things that they're more worried about that are priority to them than their own health and, health and the long-term future implications of that brain injury and their recovery. If they choose to utilize those processes and they choose to go and get a neurological screen, like, beautiful, love that. We understand that that is going to make their time with you easier. If they are more worried about getting their kids safe, about feeding themselves, about getting them housed first, and they choose to take that screening later and take that to a doctor at a later time after they are safe and stable, then I still consider this a win, right? Because that is an individual who is now taking their own health into their own hands, and it empowers them later after they have done the things that they deem most important here and now. So respond with patience, right? As is the brain injury lens prescribes, but also respond understanding that they may act on this now, they may act on it later. The way they act may differ through the recovery process, and all of those things are the correct way to do it, right? Coalition obviously promotes survivor-led recovery efforts. This is just another piece to that.
Great. Would anybody else like to add anything about service providers and best practices for responding to TBIs?
Yeah, I would just add on that grace and compassion in working with individuals. I know working with individuals who've experienced brain injury can be a frustrating population. But if you take a step back and take a look at those root causes, and they're not trying to be a jerk and they're not trying to make your job harder, it's genuinely cognitive or physical or emotional limitations caused by their brain injury. And so if you go through this process of doing a screener or evaluating some of those limitations, and then put in strategies or modifications or accommodations in place to help support those limitations, surprise, all of a sudden people are motivated. All of a sudden they show up because now they have reminders on their phone and they have these things in place. It's a huge self-advocacy tool when individuals can identify those things and then let people know, I learn best when. And that can be for family members, that can be for friends, it can be in the workplace, it can be in any kind of setting of I learn best when, or having those components and strategies in place. I mean, even just thinking brain injury or not, how much do you use your smartphone to manage your kids' activity schedule, or using reminders on your Outlook calendar for work, or task list and things like that? All of those strategies are well integrated into our culture. It's just a matter of figuring out what works best. I've had clients, they think Post-its are the best thing, and then you just have Post-its everywhere, and then none of the Post-its mean anything. And so that strategy works for some, but not all. So it's really individualizing the approach and providing the support to those individuals.
Great. So, y'all have talked about resources available to survivors who do have a traumatic brain injury. Can you speak more about kind of what recovery looks like and what treatment options are out there specifically?
I can take that one. So, I mean, recovery is going to look different for everybody. I mean, it's just like, the phrase that said a lot within brain injury work is if you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. I mean, it's just people could have two very similar brain injuries in the same part of the brain, but their trajectory is completely different. Commonly, I mean, when you go through and you have a brain injury and you go through the emergency room, acute care, post-acute, outpatient rehab, that's typical. But again, there's not really a prescriptive way to support that. But common options are things such as like rehab. So you think of occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, and those can really be helpful. And it wasn't until I worked in a rehab hospital that I knew the full scope of speech therapy. I really was always under the impression it had to do with like forming words, but it includes swallowing, it includes cognitive rehab, and there's a lot of different components within even just that one domain, let alone the other domains as well. Counseling services, neuropsych, those can really be helpful and beneficial for helping individuals better understand themselves and what their needs are. But those are some of the ones that I've seen are more common.
So it sounds like there are multiple symptoms and ways that people respond to having a TBI, and there are also multiple treatment options. That's super handy to know. Cara, I really appreciated earlier how you spoke to the impact of having a TBI that's not healed and then having another TBI occur on top of that and increasing the harm that someone experiences. Is there anything else that you would say about the risks of not getting treatment for a TBI?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it just like we've been talking, you have these symptoms, and then if they're left untreated, they can look like other things. And that was one of the things when Ashley and Beth were talking earlier, especially talking about these symptoms. They can mimic, when Beth was listing all these symptoms, they mimic so many other psychological and mental and physical symptoms and conditions. And so if a survivor presents to the doctor and maybe explains their symptoms, potentially misdiagnosed, and so that just leads to, maybe they're in, they don't get the right treatment, or maybe they're exited involuntarily from shelter because it's just not a good fit, or they need reminders in a different way. So it can lead to a lot of different things. I think the biggest thing, obviously, as far as like specifically with strangulation, of course, there's always like the risk of death, so certain things like that. There's other long-term medical conditions that can happen, chronic medical conditions that I think can happen from TBIs. And then, of course, when you have these chronic and ongoing traumatic brain injuries, that's going to continue to exacerbate any long-term effects.
Thank you for speaking to that. You all have already covered a lot of information, and we still have a lot of information to cover and talk about. But I did want to make sure that you got the chance to speak to any kind of foundational intersections between domestic violence and TBIs. Is there anything else you want to be sure listeners are aware of before we move on to other topics of our conversation?
Yeah, so when we screen, we aren't necessarily just talking about maybe a one-time blow to the head or a one-time, very one-time recent strangulation instance. We're talking about lifetime instance because this could, somebody could have a brain injury and be repeatedly injured from an early like a soccer injury when they were a kid, right? And it just kept getting exacerbated. Somebody could present at a shelter in an abusive relationship but the head injury started in a previous relationship, right? Or a car accident before. So when we're talking about TBIs, this is beyond just the singular instance or a singular relationship. We're talking lifetime instance with any sort of injury.
Interesting. Thanks for speaking to that.
One thing I would say that's really important to keep in mind too is if you're thinking about the components of abuse and things like gaslighting and psychological abuse. So if somebody has a brain injury and they're struggling with memory, they're struggling with some of these things, that the abuser is then, oh, you're so stupid, you can't even remember this stuff, when really it's brain injury. And so then the abuser's using that as tools to further that. So I think that that's something also that is important to keep in mind.
It certainly is. I'm glad you spoke to it. Cara, you have a lot of experience around responding to strangulation in domestic violence situations. And so, could you explain what the connection is between strangulation and TBI specifically?
Sure. So strangulation is cutting off blood flow or airflow, and then so that would restrict that oxygen or the blood, and so that can potentially result in a traumatic brain injury. And so I think that is one of the things. And so twofold. One, I think the lack of awareness about the like how scary it is to be strangled, and how severe it is for somebody to strangle someone and like what potentially happens and all of that. And then the lack of awareness, I think, as far as like what symptoms can present from that, what like medical treatments there are potentially out there. And I think, along the TBI realm, as far as the intersection with domestic violence, we hear so much research as far as football and sports and TBI, but we know that domestic violence so far exceeds how many TBIs there are, yet there's so little research at that intersection. And so I think that is where like more research needs to be done, is because we know that those neurons in our brain, they're not being repaired. And there's actually like women's neurons are smaller than men's neurons. And so they're actually like more sensitive and can't be repaired as easily. So like it's a whole thing. And so it's just very sensitive, and there's just not enough research into it. And, our brains aren't able to like repair the way that other parts of our bodies are able to. And, especially when we see these repeated incidences, that's where it gets really scary.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's different about getting a brain injury from being a football player and get a brain injury from experiencing violence. There's the added fear of stress and fear and emotional dysregulation. And we know so much about how that kind of trauma impacts the brain. I definitely cannot wait to see more research around that. And I'm really excited to see how it impacts our advocacy. Speaking of advocacy services, Ashlea, you do a lot around violence prevention specifically. Is there anything you want to speak to around your expertise in violence prevention and TBI work?
So it's an interesting intersection where violence prevention and intervention come together. One of the projects that another state is really working on that I would love to gain more traction here in Missouri is actually screening batterers and looking at how many abusers who are going through the batterers intervention programs would actually screen positive for a brain injury, and then correlating that to potential reasons as to why they were abusing in the first place, especially when we understand that, a lot of times survivors will go back to their abuser, or an abuser will move on to another relationship and continue to abuse, right? If we could treat those people who are abusing because a brain injury is affecting their emotional regulation and giving them that short fuse or what have you, right? Then we are effectively preventing them from abusing again. So I am super interested to see how that progresses. We currently have one BIP program in the state who is committed to working on this with us, and I would love to increase that. So yeah, I think that right now is one of the most tangible prevention efforts that we have within in our project, and one that I'm really passionate about.
That is a fascinating point and super interesting, especially to think about the implications for prevention. I'm so glad you brought that up. So much to talk about just with that. I feel like it could be its own episode of the podcast, but that is really interesting. I would like, though, to hear more from you, Beth, and your work at UMKC. So, how did brain injuries become kind of a priority or a program that UMKC wanted to address?
So the Institute for Human Development has had a state partnership program grant. We've been a subcontractor for many years. So it's Department of Health and Senior Services is the grant lead, and then they subcontract with the IHD. It's funded through the Administration for Community Living, and it offers supports for a variety of focus, prevention being one of them, and systems change work. And I believe there's 20 something states that are awardees of this grant. And so kind of how that folded into brain injury screening and kind of our OBISSS tools. So when I came on board, I had a strong passion and a lot of interest in further developing our brain injury program with IHD. And brain injury screening was something that I felt strongly about, but had given myself pause just because I was so stuck on the now what. It was just somebody screens positive and go on with your day. Like, I mean, I really had a hard time with that. And so when OBISSS was created a couple of years ago, it put together the brain injury screening tool, the OSU, University of Ohio State, Ohio State University, that tool, which is kind of the gold standard with screeners, but it combined that with the symptoms questionnaire. And then based on individuals, so if they do screen positive, they complete the symptoms questionnaire to self-identify areas that they may be struggling with. And then from there, it takes those different areas and gives suggestions on accommodations, modifications specific to those areas. And then also with OBISSS being unique in that it is an online platform, so this process is automated. So they automatically get emailed if they provide an email address to their inbox. But it's also twofold because that information goes to the provider that they're working with for accommodations, modifications, and how to support that individual. But then it also goes to the individual how to self-advocate. And then in addition to that, it also provides some resources specific to the state. And so it's really a great tool. Prior to this, I mean, there's a lot of great tools that are out there, but just something that really addressed the now what was the biggest sticking point, honestly. And so we're so thankful that this tool allows for that.
Can you tell us what the OBISSS acronym stands for?
Oh, yes, that would be helpful. So OBISSS is the Online Brain Injury Screening and Support System. It is a screener tool, and it's just that. It is only a screener. It is not diagnostic, but it can then be used to help with self-advocacy. You can take the results and then go on and talk to a physician, primary care, neuropsychologist, and obtain some further testing and diagnosis. But I also think that it's important to note that it being only a screener tool and not medical, it's not part of the person's medical records. So in this environment, that's really important to note because it's not part of, it's not a diagnosis, so it can't necessarily be used against anyone. As I know that could potentially be a fear when you're thinking custody, when you're thinking of some of these other implications. It's really just knowledge. It's knowledge for themselves, and it doesn't go any further than that unless they choose to share it with other entities.
That's
And
really interesting.
I'll
Yeah, go
add
ahead,
something
Ash.
about confidentiality there as well. That was my huge sticking point when getting this developed for our population. Because, as advocates are very well aware, we have some very strict confidentiality rules for a lot of very, very good reasons, right? So when people are filling the screener out, they are not putting in any identifiable information, and it is really truly being sent to themselves and their caseworkers. And there are some options there that they can choose in order to determine where it goes and who sees it. So this is, along with it not being diagnostic, not being medical, it is also not being stored in a way that can be tied back to them if something were to end up being subpoenaed later on.
It's really helpful to know. Can you all speak to what opportunities there are for service providers, specifically domestic violence advocacy programs, to integrate OBISSS into their services?
Yeah, so we are in process of running a pilot and bringing new people on. We have a handful of agencies spanning from BIP providers to shelters to different centers. We even have, medical personnel who are really interested in the tool who have done an onboarding process with us where Beth comes in and leads the presentation, and I really just support through that process. She's the star of the show there. But leads this onboarding of teaching the staff, why is this important? How do you integrate? And then we work through implementation plans. So what is it that your staff need in order to make this work? What does this need to look like for you? So as one survivor is not similar to another, as one brain injury is not similar to another, implementation by space is all very, very tailorable to what that agency has to offer. So, talking about getting people involved, you just, at this point, just got to reach out, let us know. Because we are always looking to add friends to this party with the ultimate goal of I would love to see this implemented in every shelter in the state, right? In order to, better get a picture of the individuals who are screening positive and get that data, but also to ensure that people are getting the resources and the referrals that they need. And honestly, I truly view this as a tool that makes advocates' lives easier, right? And so I want every advocate to have access to this to make their lives easier. This reduces advocate burnout in the long run too, which is something that is, really prevalent right now and has always been in this field, but especially right now.
Yeah, so you said reach out if you're interested. Tell us more about if an agency is interested in learning more about OBISSS, potentially even incorporating it into the services that they are offering to survivors. What does reaching out look like?
So it's connecting with myself, it is connecting with Beth, it is even a general reach to the coalition's info page, right? Our friends at the coalition understand that this project is going on and that it is important, and so they will route you where you need to go. But if you want to reach out directly to myself, my email is awhaley@MOCADSV.
And we can include everyone's contact information in the show notes of this episode too for people looking for more information. I do
There are a
though.
few things that I just
Yeah.
wanted to add on real quick. One, I just really want to highlight that although OBISSS is subscription based, the cost is completely covered through our grants. There's no cost for providers. There's no cost for survivors to complete the OBISSS and participate. So I just really wanted to highlight that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that, yes, if you're in Missouri, definitely reach out to us, reach out to the coalition. But if you do happen to have listeners in other states, and if they want to find out if their state offers OBISSS as an option, then that would be, I direct them to NASHA, the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators.
Great. We'll include that in the show notes for our episode as well. I would like to hear about any outcomes that you are hearing from MOCDSV members who are already participating in the OBISSS program. What are you all hearing from advocacy organizations about their work with survivors?
That it's working, that they're getting the results that I think we always assumed that they would get. There is a significant high positive screen rate, but also that knowledge is already being utilized beyond just individual casework. And one of the stories that I have really clung to already was that one of our agencies did the screening process with somebody in an outreach center. That individual screened positive. That individual was then able to take that positive screening to their disability lawyer and say, look, here is this thing that I have that is going to help our case, right? So you can choose to utilize that information. And that lawyer chose to utilize that information in that way. And that individual was able to get their disability coverage. So we're spanning just beyond the initial inherent medical interventions to seeing this having a supporting role in other spaces as well.
The more you all talk about it, I'm just seeing it as a win-win-win type of program. So really exciting to hear about all this. Anything else you wanted to be sure to say about OBISSS today? That covers it. Okay, great. Well,
Just come join us. If you're not already streaming, come back for our part stream.
I am lucky enough at MOCADSV to work on the same team as Cara Jones. Cara is what you might call a mastermind of resources. She always has a referral for something. She always knows where to go to get more information. So sorry to put you on the spot, Cara, but we already mentioned coming to you MOCADSV if you have questions and want to know more about TBIs. We already mentioned also contacting Beth at the Institute for Human Development at UMKC if you want more information. Cara, do you have any thoughts about where people could get more information about strangulation, TBIs, anything like that? I'd love to hear it.
I do. Of course. Yes. So I had mentioned earlier the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. They have lots of good trainings out there if you are interested in more strangulation. I previously was involved in attempting to start up a strangulation protocol, and that's a whole other conversation. And so there is that resource out there. The Ohio Domestic Violence Network has also done a lot of brain injury, head injury work, and so they're also a great resource. And then, of course, if you are looking for something more local, we also do have our Show Me Echo. And so I'll just, of course, highlight that. And so you can always reach out to me at cjones@mocadsv.org if you're interested in that. And that will just be a resource for all kinds of disciplines. It's an MDT that meets the first Wednesday of the month. If you do have sexual assault cases or brain injury cases that you'd like to talk about with kind of the hive mind, we're happy to have you there.
Thank you for that wealth of information. Any other favorite resources you all wanted to mention?
The Institute for Human Development has completed a free online brain injury training. It takes self-paced. It takes about an hour to complete, and it's open to anyone. It's in 4 modules. It provides some brain injury basics. It talks about a little bit of specialty populations and so forth. So I recommend that to anybody, and we can include a link to that in the show notes. And then also through our Missouri Brain Injury Advisory Council, we have established a brain injury listserv. And so as part of that, we have a monthly newsletter where we share out resources and upcoming data and a variety of different things that are happening within Missouri and nationwide. So you can sign up for that listserv if you want to learn more, for sure. And then we have other resources in general. We have like the Brain Injury Association of Missouri is a great resource, and they're providing a lot of resource facilitation in connecting individuals. They complete the OBISSS, and that's one of the main resources. And then we have Department of Health Adult Brain Injury Program is also a great program to support individuals.
So what I'm hearing here is that there are lots of places you can go if you want more information about TBIs. That is just really great to hear, and we'll be sure to include information about that for our listeners. As we're wrapping up this episode, I want to talk about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. You all did mention awareness as being an issue related to TBIs. So I would love to hear your thoughts about anything you wish that there was more awareness of when it comes to the intersection of domestic violence and TBIs. What do you want the public to know more about?
I think just reiterating a lot of the conversation that we had before, which is that the two are so deeply intertwined, right? And so if a general member of the public knows somebody who may be having issues with domestic violence in their life, a potential in would be talking about this process, talking about screening, talking about, hey, I've noticed these behaviors, this can sometimes be an issue. Do you want to do a screen? Do you want to talk to somebody? Right? So maybe they're not interested in talking to you about the violence going on at home, but maybe they're interested in talking to you about their health, or you feel more comfortable talking to somebody about their health. And so that might be a way in, right? As everybody tries to find a way in with those that they love and they care about. and again goes hand in hand with this concept of everybody knows somebody. So if everybody knows somebody who is affected by domestic violence, you very likely know somebody who is affected by a traumatic brain injury, right? And that might help explain some of the behaviors or interactions that you're having with that individual as well. So layering on that kindness and compassion and patience that you would with somebody you know who is brain injured, right? To somebody you may suspect is going through an abusive situation.
Beautifully said, Ashley. Anything else you all would add to that?
If you take nothing else away from this discussion, I just want to highlight you are already interacting with people struggling with brain injury in your personal and professional life, whether you realize it or not. The Brain Injury Association of America estimates that 1 in 60 individuals, there's 1 in 60 Americans at any given time living with long-term disability related to brain injury. It's there. It's an invisible disability oftentimes, and you're already interacting with these individuals. So like Ashley said, that compassion and grace to when in your interactions with others.
I would only add that there is no safe way to have your hands around somebody else's head, neck, or face. And it is so important that if you have had a brain or head injury or suspect you have had, that you reach out to somebody and just go through your options and reach out for supportive services and kind of work through that, and that we continue to raise awareness and bring this issue forward so we can continue to provide those resources to survivors who have experienced traumatic brain injuries or strangulations due to domestic violence.
You all just raised such important points, and I really look forward to seeing how we can all increase our capacity to respond to brain injuries in the future in Missouri. So thank you so much, Ashley, Cara, and Beth, for joining me on the podcast today. This has been a great discussion, and I have learned so much from you all. So many thanks for joining us for this discussion, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We look forward to having you join us next month for a new episode of Momentum for Change. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.